Chapter 3. IT began, as IT always did, with the creaking of wheels and the crack of whips. The path up the slope was uneven and steep, yet the traders would push their horses to the limit in the final stretch, eager for the prime locations at the end of the village's main road. Those who were last inevitably ended up by the gate entrance, away from the milling crowds deep inside the village. Casper stood at the entrance and waved them through, nodding and smiling to each of the drivers of the heavy, laden wagons as they rolled through the gates. Fletcher could see the horses had been pushed hard on this journey, their flanks shone with a froth of sweat and their eyes were wild with exhaustion. His face broke into a guilty grin at the state of them, knowing Burden would be kept busy today. He hoped they had enough horseshoes for all of them. As the last of the wagons pulled through the gate, two men with heavy blonde mustaches and peaked caps trotted into the village. Their horses were not the plow horses that pulled the wagons, but heavy chargers with wide flanks and plate-sized hooves. They tossed their bridles as they moved from the dirt path onto the uneven cobbles. Fletcher heard Burden curse behind him and grimaced with sympathy. The men's dark blue uniforms and brass buttons identified them as Pinkertons, lawmakers from the city. The muskets they held in their hands left no doubt of their status. Fletcher glanced at the metal-studded truncheons that sat holstered by the panniers in their saddles. They could break an arm or a leg with ease, and they had no qualms about doing so, for the Pinkertons were only answerable to the king. Fletcher had no idea why they were accompanying the convoy, but their presence meant that there would be little need for protection on the route. There would be few sales at his stall that day. The two men looked so alike they might have been brothers, with curling blonde hair and cold gray eyes. They dismounted and the taller of the two strode up to Fletcher, his mushket hanging loosely in his hands. "Boy, take our horses to the village stable and have them fed and watered," he said with a hard voice. Fletcher gaped at him, taken aback by the directness of the order. The man motioned at the horses as Fletcher paused, unwilling to leave the stall unattended. "Don't mind him. He's a bit slow in the head," Casper's voice cut in. "We don't have a village stable. My son will see to your horses. Didrik, take them to our personal stables and tell the stable boy to take extra care." "But, father, I wanted to," Didrik began, his voice wheedling. "Now, and be quick about it," Casper interrupted. Didrik reddened and flashed Fletcher a black look, before taking the bridles of the two horses and leading them down the street. "So, what brings the Pinkertons to Pelt? We haven't seen any new faces for several weeks. If you are chasing outlaws," Casper said, holding his hand out. The tall Pinkerton shook his hand reluctantly, forced to be civil now that his horse was in Casper's care. "Our business is with the military on the Elven border. The king has expressed a desire to conscript criminals into the army, in doing so writing off their prison sentences. We are investigating whether the generals would be amenable to that, on his behalf." Quotation mark. Fascinating. Of course we knew that the enlistment rates had dropped recently, but this comes as a surprise. "What an elegant solution to the problem," Casper said with a fixed smile. "Perhaps we can talk more about it over dinner and some brandy? Between you and me, the local inn is filthy, and we would be happy to provide you with comfortable beds after your long journey. We would be grateful. We have traveled all the way from Corsilum and have not slept in a clean bed for almost a week," the Pinkerton admitted, doffing his cap. "Then we must draw you a bath and have a hot breakfast brought to you. My name is Caspar Cavell. I am a village elder of sorts here," Casper said, leading them down the road. Fletcher considered the news as their voices faded. Criminals being pressed into the armed services was something he had never considered. Rumors had abounded that forced conscription for all young men was right around the corner, something that both worried and excited him. Conscription had been implemented in the Second Orc War, centuries ago. That war had been fought over orc raiding parties that stole livestock and slaughtered the townsfolk in the fledgling Hominum Empire. Hundreds of villages had been wiped out before the orcs were driven back into the jungles. This time it was Hominum who had started it, clearing away their forests to fuel the industrial revolution that had just begun. That had been 7 years ago, and the war showed no sign of ending anytime soon. "If I could forge those muskets, there would be no need to open the stall at all." Burden grumbled from behind him. Fletcher nodded in agreement. Muskets were in high demand on the front line, manufactured by the dwarven artificers that lived in the bowels of Corsilum. The techniques used to create their straight barrels and mechanisms were closely guarded secrets that the dwarves harbored jealously. It was a lucrative business, yet the technology had only been recently implemented in the military, where before the orcs could often endure a hail of arrows when they charged. A barrage of musket fire had far more stopping power. It was then Fletcher noticed a final traveler enter through the gates. He was a grizzled soldier, with gray hair and an unshaven face. He wore a red and white uniform, the cloth tattered and worn, spattered with mud and dust from the journey. Many of the brass buttons from his coat were missing or hanging loose. He was unarmed, unusual for a member of a trading convoy and even more so for a soldier. He had no horse or wagon, but instead led a mule that was heavily laden with saddlebags. His boots were in a sorry state, the soles worn through and flapping with each staggering step he took. Fletcher watched as he settled in the space opposite him, tying the mule to the corner post of the next stall over and glaring at the vendor before he could protest. He unpacked his saddlebags, spreading out a bundle of cloth and arranging several objects upon it. The soldier was likely on his way to the elven front, culled for being too old to fight as a soldier any longer, yet too incompetent to have been promoted to an officer. As if he could sense his gaze, the old man straightened and grinned at Fletcher's curiosity, showing a mouth full of missing teeth. Fletcher craned his neck to get a better look at the soldier, and his eyes widened as he saw what was for sale. There were huge flint arrowheads the size of a man's hand, the edges pitted to create barbs that would snag in the flesh. Necklaces made from strings of teeth and desiccated ears were untangled and laid out like the finest pendants. A rhino's horn, tipped with an iron point, was arranged at the very front of the collection. The centerpiece was a huge orc skull, twice the size of a man's. It had been polished smooth and bleached by the jungle sun, with a heavy brow ridge jutting unnaturally over its eye holes. The orc's lower canines were larger than Fletcher had imagined, extending out into tusks that were around 3 inches long. These were souvenirs from the front lines, to be sold as curiosities to northern cities, far from where the real war was being fought. Fletcher turned and looked beseechingly at Burden, who had also seen what the man had for sale. He shook his head and nodded at the stall. Fletcher sighed and turned his attention back to the arrangement of his own goods. It was going to be a long, fruitless day.